Well, I was amazed. You know very well I'm not going to say, oh yes, but of course. But I really didn't expect it, but I'm really happy because I fell in love with Edinburgh when I got off the Eastern Scottish night bus in '73 and walked out onto Princess Street, and it was brilliantly sunny, very cold. And the big maroon and white buses were sailing up and down Princess Street. I'd just been in London for 6 weeks, and all of a sudden people were walking up and saying, can I help you? And do you have any questions? And in London, they wouldn't say that, just to say it as discreetly as possible. But the other aspect of it that I didn't expect was that I started to ask some questions and wonder, and that's come out in this talk. It struck me that women are all around us, where they lived, where they worked. This was a very small city, even 50 years ago compared to now, and so I started looking into things and wondering, and now I've got a whole new class of things to wonder about, which always makes me happy.
Also, I was completely stunned. I mean, I felt I've always been somebody who's on the margins of wherever I am. Why me? But I'm very careful. I think it's lovely that people are thinking about these issues. I felt deeply honoured and completely unqualified, but I'm quite appreciative, to be honest, because I suppose it does make people curious, if nothing else. And because Edinburgh, which is strangely enough, you'll find two transatlantic origin people, but from Edinburgh has become, I've been here even longer than she has. I got here in '71, having been here for a summer course at the university, just one of these sort of things where foreigners come and are given a little taste of the glories of Scottish education. And that was in, I think, '67, and then came back to live here in '71. And so I've had a few years in London, and 3 years in Glasgow, 4 years in Glasgow. And I'm an Edinburgh lady. I just can't pronounce, but my accent is still New Jersey. So it's always a bit problematical. But, so it's amazing to feel that, this city has changed my life. I had to leave provincial Manhattan and the environs to come to red hot Edinburgh. There is something about, but Edinburgh has so many layers, so many dimensions. Edinburgh, some Edinburgh-born friends who were LGBT before there were any initials, before you could sort of, you could apologize. We all said gay because it was quick and you could get it out and say it to your parents really fast, and it was over. Mom, I'm gay. But there were, the time I came was still a time when people I know who have since perhaps come back or keep their ties had left here, had run like heck to get away from here because it was a place that they felt confined and claustrophobic, and if you didn't see your Auntie Jeannie in the street who was seeing you maybe just in the wrong place at the wrong time, it felt like that to them. But to those of us, from other places, I suppose with the freedom of being an outsider, you can reinvent yourself. And Edinburgh is a place of sort of that conjures up inspiration, admiration. I remember just the other week asked an Edinburgh friend of mine, I sort of get up in the morning and I, just sort of round the corner from the crags and I look up and you never stop when you walk outside, or seeing that rose red just before sunset light when it all goes that way. There's never a day when I was like, oh wow. And I said, you were born here, you were, born in wherever, Leith and wound up in Restorative or somewhere. And do you still feel that? She said, yeah, I still say, oh wow, every day. Yeah. And I mean, there are so many things about the city that if you get it, all the stupid stereotypes from elsewhere about us, you just realize how wrong they are. I sort of live in a lot of different worlds at once. And so, Dr. is really quick.
That's true.
And because I am really ancient, I don't always remember things. I've got notes in case I forget. Okay, my mother, who was a librarian, and in the 50s, was a working mother, and it was a time when if you were, you were supposed to be a housewife, and for your father not to be able to keep the family. It was, kind of a bit of a humiliation in some ways. And I was so proud of her. She started, I think, as the office lady in a primary school and got her master's in library science, as it was called in the States, which I guess maybe it's all still called, and became a school librarian. And so she's also part of this multi-generational clan of very powerful, very tough-minded women. But she was the first to go to college, or you would stay here. It was a small teachers' college, but it was that sense that my mother was special, and I was really proud of her for working. Unfortunately, it was an extended family with a widowed granny who was there 40 years after I left. She was still there. We did the childcare, so it worked out. But there were these incredible strong women, so they were really important. I had an English teacher, Miss Stolfi, Dora Stolfi, who really encouraged my writing. And I wrote a couple of poems and I sort of shyly showed them to her. And I guess it must have been around 13 or 14, that's what beneath her 9th grade in American terms. And we were doing a poetry unit, I suppose, or whatever they called it, the next day. And she photocopied the poems I'd written without my name on them. And they were looked at and done along with real poets. And gosh, that was just so exciting. So she was important. When I came to Edinburgh, friends who were important. A very close friend of mine from even that first summer was a woman, Linda Miles, whose name, if you're interested in cinema, you might know. She's still my oldest surviving on the side of the ocean friend. And she in her early 20s, became the director of the Edinburgh Film Festival. She was the first woman in the world to be a film festival director. I think there should still possibly be, there were a series of women's plaques, women's history plaques, so that I think her plaque should still be in Film News. But she was incredibly knowledgeable about cinema, knowledgeable about the arts. She created what I think had been the first women's event, whether it was in the UK or Europe, or possibly women's film event, 72 here. And some extremely heavy hitters came and spoke in the very early days of feminism. So she was a great cultural and political inspiration and a challenge, and I love her dearly, and she continues to be. An old dear friend who's finally come back from alien lands further south of the border, like London, who's now back in Edinburgh, so that's great. And Iona McGregor, among other things, when I was just sort of coming out as a lesbian, and I worked in book publishing, although I worked in children's publishing, so, nothing it was not going to connect with my life, except you're an editor, you're working with words. Sort of found out about Iona and started seeing her at sort of children's book events for librarians and booksellers and people and authors and kids and English teachers would all come together. And, here was this woman who, she was writing wonderful sort of historical fiction, Scottish historical fiction, and all that, but she was a lesbian. And I was just trying to figure out if I was. And I think she was one of the first lesbians I met who was not a scary PE teacher, And so, she was important, and, she was a complicated, colorful, intellectually juicy person, and so she was definitely, and she was so Edinburgh, because, we did sit in one of the old National Portrait Gallery cafe, this beautiful room, and, you'd sort of lean over for that really good gossip, and you had to do that Edinburgh thing before you said anything. And, which of course was probably maybe you still do. Anyway, so long enough.
Well, I grew up in a town of 2,000 in the Central Valley of California, which is California's answer to Kansas. And almost everyone in it was of Scandinavian background like me, so that the mentors were in pretty short supply. And but when I moved to the nearby large town, which was what they would call a cow town in America, I was amazed to realize how many there were. There was my English teacher, Viola Bedford. I looked her up later and found that she lived to be 100. She was taking part in mentoring students right up till then, as far as I could tell. She loved language, she loved writing. And what I realized looking back on it is that if you started to love language yourself, you started to love what you had to say, and you started to be aware of it in a way that you never were. Then my family moved to a suburb of San Francisco, which was about 2 steps up from Kansas, but not that much. And I had an English teacher who had been a bohemian in New York, and her suit and straight skirt never matched. Her heels always looked like they were going to come off. She was, I think she had lived a pretty wild life in New York. She may even have known communists for all I know. And she was the one who told me about Edna St. Vincent Millay, and how, as a student, she wrote a sonnet, and it's a requiem for her lover, who Edna St. Vincent Millay rejected her, I'm afraid, after the college put pressure on her, and her lover, who was a big butch sailor, committed suicide. And this teacher told me this story, and of course I went straight out and read the poem, and fell in love with Edna St. Vincent Millay, and walked around saying her poetry. And that was a step on the way to asking questions about myself. Not that there weren't already too many answers to those, because I fell in love when I was 15. And you should never do that, because when you're in love, especially when you're the person you're in love with, everybody knows. And if you're 15, they want to intervene. So it just made me angry. It never occurred to me to try to change. Even when my therapist told me that I was not a homosexual because I'd had a dream about wearing a bra. She was an accidental mentor, because after just listening to her for 2 years and saying, oh, maybe you're right, yes, maybe you're right, maybe I was a therapist in that situation, she finally said, I can see this is something you don't want taken away from you, which was a diplomatic way of surrendering, I think. So then I came to Edinburgh, and this is the moment to mention Ellen Galford again. Here she is. This is Lavender Menace Career Books Archives poster of her. And we also have cards in our Queer Writers series and bookmarks. And I walked into the Gay Center, never having been anywhere near a place like that before, wondering what it was going to be like. And there was Iona McGregor, wearing her lovely jacket, at least as it is in my memory, and telling me all about her writing and how she was going to Cumbria on her motorcycle with someone she just met. And I joined SMG, the Scottish Minorities Group, and joined the women's group, joined the SMG bookstall, which had been set up by Bob Mural, and the rest is history.
I've got really long list and we don't have time for that. There's thousands of people. But in terms of inspirations, the kinds of things I was reading, I was always a bit of a sort of time travel. So when I was very, very young, I started reading outside the cultural space I come from. You know, sort of what you would have been, when you say middle classes or affluent, there's, you know, school teacher's kid, Jewish, very left-wing, or reasonably by American standards, left-wing family background. And, you know, it was New York, in the New York area, so, you know, you were surprised to know like there were still Jews alive in New York. That was like a big, there's still, you know, they weren't all destroyed, you know. It was like that period when you're coming into your own consciousness into the 50s, you know, because I was born in 1947, so, you know, it was kind of, the sense of the war was just over your shoulder. But in terms of, there was something, that explosion in publishing and access to books. Like, I got very interested in the fact that people were writing books in medieval times, in China, in Japan. So I got very excited by writers like Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote The Tale of Genji. She was a courtier. She was one of the women of the court of the Heian Emperor, which was early 11th century Japan. But she wrote this long epic about Prince Genji and then the generations after Genji. But the minutiae of life in the court and life among Japanese people of that class, and the way lovers connected and the communications, and the high aestheticism of, you know, writing poems on autumn leaves that had blown through the window from a westerly direction, you know, or, you know.
It sounds like an Instagram video.
It kind of, yeah. So there are things, and so I was very excited about that, very excited about the Middle Ages in the West, Hildegard of Bingen. I was very excited by nuns. Women who wore amazing medieval clothing, lived with other women in a group. I mean, you know, the notion that there might be some priest telling you what to think was not really part of the fantasy. But just that concept of autonomous, independent women. So that was sort of exciting. And then when one got a bit older, I suppose writers, you know, the early feminist writers, as I was, you know, coming into my own decision, boy, you know, you thought you were heterosexual, and did you ever get on the wrong train? you might spend a long time kind of seeking wonderful things that didn't quite happen until you thought, well, maybe I'm not. Maybe you don't have to be a PE teacher. And, although I should say, my partner now of 42 years, 41-year-old's coming up for 43 week, started as a PE teacher. But anyway, so people like Kate Millett and Judith Firestone, all those early feminist political writers were incredibly important and to me, and then so were the not necessarily literary high quality stuff, but there was suddenly in the beginning of the 70s this surge of lesbian writing coming out of the States, and thanks to bookshops, you know, in London there was Sister Wright, and you know, then Silver Moon here, because when I was in London for a few years, and coming back, there was Lavender Menace, then Western Wilds came, and the sense that, you know, Gates the Word also in London, and books were coming in, although the customs people, as I'm sure Sigrid would tell you, were not cooperative. So at least the material was starting to flow, and ideas were starting to flow. And I think one book that I think has become even more significant in a strange way now, because of the evolution in consciousness, even inside the LGBT community, was a book called The Cook and the Carpenter, where there was an author pseudonymously, June Arnold was the author. She wrote a couple of other books of lesbian life and fiction, but The Cook and the Carpenter was very exciting because she did not use gender pronouns. You were reading, she invented, it was all, you know, and of course you couldn't use things like they and them. I can still hear, Miss Stolfi wouldn't have liked, that was grammatically wrong, you know, you couldn't say they when you meant she or he, you know, and so on and so forth. But the gender pronouns were all na and non, was what her, you know, for subject and object pronouns and things, until the last 5 pages of the book, when something very dramatic and powerful happened, and suddenly at that moment, all of the specific he's, she's were emerged, and you suddenly discovered, you might or might not have guessed who the characters were before that, sort of until 198 pages in or whatever, bang. So that was kind of an interesting, in retrospect, it's even, it may not have been high literature, but it was an interesting thought
So
process.
was that a bit of a revelation to have these identities revealed?
Yeah, it was meant as a kind of dramatic thing, and it was in some ways kind of a relief, because it was like the equivalent of, say, if you come out of just reading standard English or American English, and you're trying to read Scots, you have to, Scots dialogue, and people are like Sir Walter Scott, and you're suddenly having to kind of get into that different sound to them. It was tricky like that. But now I think back, I think, yeah, that was quite a wake-up call.
Well, I was a nerd, but the word hadn't been invented, especially not dyke female nerd. And I read for escape, because that was about all you could do. I read a lot of science fiction.
Someone has brought art for library with her.
I'll show you one of the most important ones. This is actually a little later. As far as I know, she's been forgotten. Sometime in the 80s, she wrote that she had just run out of creative inspiration for whatever reason, which is why I would like to promote what she did right now, because this is an incredibly subtle book. It's about 2 gay men. It's in a future world where every kind of sexuality is totally accepted, and the hero is an artist, and he has a terminal disease, and what he wants to do is find a planet where there's light that he's never painted with before, and make a series of paintings that will count all the others. And this and Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness would prove to me that you could be strange and off the beam and subversive, and at the same time subtle, and have something to say about life. It was especially The Left Hand of Darkness which made me think this could be my life, even though it takes place on another planet. And I also read anything I could get my hands on, the more scandalous the better. And such as John Ritchie's City of Night, which is full of every kind of nefarious queer stereotype there is, but he'd met them all, he knew them, so he wasn't rejecting them, he was just describing them. And then, just like Ellen, I discovered Kate Millett, and she lived with Firestone in the early 70s, and then one day I was in New Mexico by this time, scanning the bookshops, and I found a book called The Gay Militants. And suddenly I discovered that Stonewall had happened, that there was a group called the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, and that the Lavender Menace had happened. In America, this kind of news never traveled far. The papers didn't print it, TV stations didn't broadcast it, and discovering this, it all came through books, but it changed life. Well, when I came to Edinburgh, I discovered it was just starting to be called the Open Gaze Books Collective, because we were very bullshit. And Baldur had started it. He had a summer job in library distribution. That there was somebody in SMG who acted as his mentor and got him this job. And the Ellender House is where it was, and that is where Grace Cowell, the suffragist, lived, and treated suffragists who had been, their health had been ruined in prison. But I just found that out last week. Anyway, he wanted to put his book-selling skills to use, and I started the bookshop and called for volunteers, and you couldn't hold me back. There were many other volunteers. The minutes of our meetings are now in the National Library of Scotland, and somebody who had read them asked me a lot of questions. That was quite a strange experience. But books are good for getting people together. Just working with them, apart from reading them, is something that keeps people together, and encourages cooperation and thought. There's probably a better word for it than that, but anyway, we all got along very well, and we decided that it could go further. And if you've ever seen the play Lavender Menace, you've heard all the scandalous tales about how SMG decided we were a bit too bullshit for them, and we left, and we started the bookshop in 4th Street, down a very dangerous stairway that wouldn't pass safety regulations today, for sure. And we raised money. We did book-stalls at Fire Island Disco. We had the most amazing time. And then in August 1982, we spent the whole summer refurbishing the place, which had damp and everything else, and painting it. And we opened on the first day of the festival because we were behind schedule and couldn't open for the Fringe. And then many people doubted whether we could possibly survive. The first bookshop was a radical bookshop in Candlemaker Row. I had worked there for a year and a half. Bob had worked for Scottish and Northern Books Distribution. We had the experience that people just weren't ready for this. People would ask us what a gay bookshop sold. So it was a long, long struggle to become solvent, but it finally happened. And that it was open for 15 years. In 1987, it became West and Wild. I left as a partner, and Bob's husband, Raymond, became his partner. And they had much bigger premises with lovely readings and wine. And I stayed on to write all the blurbs because I was addicted.
Well, I suppose that I have always, from, as I say, writing poems at age whatever. I think apparently the first one, age 3. But I really, really wanted to write and wrote poetry. But I think I had a very messy time in my sort of late teens and very early 20s, and felt I had just kind of moved into a life that was wrong. Being a nice Jewish girl on my 3 days after my 22nd birthday, got married to a nice Jewish man, who of course happened to be from London, and who, after I had come out as gay many years later, he came out as gay. So it was all kind of complicated, but it confused our parents. But it took me until I had decided, I had been at that same period, I was in Edinburgh doing an MLit in Elizabethan literature, which because I'd always thought, I will be an academic, that's what I want to be. And somehow at the point where I sort of thought, wait a minute, I am now struggling to write a dissertation about somebody who, Thomas Nash, the author of Pierce Penniless, about a text that I was having to write longer than a particular text that interested me. It was more words than that. And I suddenly realized he died when he was 2 years younger than I am now. This is not, maybe I really don't want to be an academic, maybe I just want to sort of write if I can. I spent my working life in publishing, because unlike certain highly successful people where you can just make money from your books, even though I published 4 novels, a variety of short things and anthologies, I've never seen it as a money significance. I'm just a publisher in terms of You know, what one would write occupationally is what I did before I retired. And but I discovered this extraordinary woman. There was an Elizabethan play, which you may or may not know, called The Roaring Girl by Middleton and Decker, two playwrights of they were sort of early 17th century, about a woman who had really lived in London, Mary Frith, who was known as an all-cut person. She was a real low life, and she dressed partly. It wasn't so much she did not wear totally male dress, but it was her own kind of combination of quite sort of butch-looking approach. She didn't look like portraits of Queen Elizabeth. And she was notorious. She was a pickpocket. She was a teacher of pickpockets. And they wrote a play about her while she was alive. And she got up at whichever of those early London theatres. So she got up and, it was there during performances. She died in the middle of the 17th century. She'd been involved in all kinds of riotous things. And I thought, there is, between Sappho and now, there's something besides the scared PE teachers. There are other things going on. And I thought, I must write about her. I was writing about her, but I was just struggling. I had a long period of kind of, hard to say writer's block, but if you haven't written much besides a few poems before that. But finally, once I came out, left married life, that, I wanted to write about Mural. And I suddenly, I found the way to do it, and I found the voice. Trying not to do fake Elizabethan, but at the same time give a flavor of that. And suddenly I thought, it was the story written about her, and using some research, because there was a biography pamphlet from the period, which the Confessions of Mrs. Mary Frith, which, there are a couple of copies, one in the museum, there was one somewhere in Oxford, that kind of thing. But it's, so it just kind of, I used some of that, but then really, essentially, I took the story was told by her female lover, her entirely fictional. And so I kind of found a voice. Mm-hmm. And it was when I had finally said to myself, okay, you are a lesbian. Then after that, it's okay, and it's okay. That's sort of after that, sort of the writing. I'm not one of these highly, prolific people who's constantly writing, but, this sort of squeezing out 4 novels, and now I've kind of, and a lot of short pieces, and then, because I was also doing day job writing in millions of words. So, it suddenly, it never really came, I was able to bring it out until I decided, figured out who I was.
So that was kind of helping.
So Mural was the start. Mural was the lesbian identity thing. Fire's Bride was the Scottish connection. And some London friend of mine said, oh dear, it's awfully Scottish nationalist. But, it was kind of, I suddenly realized that the 4 novels I published were in different ways, but it was also kind of trying to reclaim a whole lot of different things. Women's stuff, mythology, goddess worship, Scottishness, etc. Then I did something which was essentially just a little political cartoon, an anti-Thatcherite thing, just laid in the Thatcher era, called Queendom Come. It was kind of, if you could imagine a sort of Guardian cartoon like Steve Bell's, in fact, he did a quote for the Novel Bravo edition. It was essentially a fantasy about this warrior queen who comes back and battles somebody who might or might not be recognizable as our first ever female prime minister. Mm-hmm. And then my 4th novel was essentially trying to reclaim Jewishness and tying that up with lesbian identity. Because I had moved away from, because I know, there were a whole lot of aspects in terms of the way Jewish life was organized at that period. It was before there was a huge explosion of the non-Zionist Jewish identity, of sexuality becoming much more open. There were the much more progressive left-wing ends of ways to be Jewish, and I kind of reconnected with that. So those 4 novels, and when I think about it, and then after that, aside from the anthology pieces, I've really gone back to poetry, the first thing. Maybe because life is too short and I'm too lazy to do the long fiction anymore, but somehow that short, tight form is giving me more freedom now, so that's really what I've come back to.
Well, I took a look at the book, and I recommend that everybody does that. The Edinburgh section isn't very long, so if you don't have much time, you can skim through it. But what I thought of was, where do these women live really? Because this is she makes a picture of an imaginary world where Princess Street is called Princess Street, and so on and so on. But somebody said to me once that it struck her that Lavender Menace bookshop was around the corner from where she worked. And I thought, where else are places that I pass every day where some of these women lived and worked that we don't know because they didn't have the money to build buildings, they didn't have, nobody thought of naming the buildings after them because it wouldn't have impressed their shareholders. But they were there and we know about it. So I started out with the people we know the best, the fighting doctors. Sophia Jex-Blake, Elsie Inglis, and another one who's not so well known called Grace Catalogue. And they lived and worked right around here. It's around the corner over there in 30 Chambers Street is where Elsie Inglis started one of her first medical schools. And for women. I expect you'll know some of this story, but Sophia Jex-Blake decided she was going to get the University of Edinburgh to take her on as a medical student. There was a lot of fighting about that, and in the end, the male medical students rioted right over here at Surgeons Hall. And the university said, well, perhaps we better reconsider all this. And so all the women, the program was discontinued, and Sophia said, then I'll start my own. And she started one of them at 11 George Square, and another one, then she went to Bern in Switzerland and got her degree. She had to wander around quite a bit before she could get her credentials, and she came straight back to Edinburgh and opened her first surgery at 4 Manor Place in the West End. Then she opened a dispensary for poor women at 73 Grove Street. 6 Grove Street is where she established a much more substantial hospital. And then she moved up to Brunsfield Hospital, where she lived, and this is where it gets interesting, possibly also with her lover, who was a novelist and the inventor of the word isotope, and also a doctor. They lived there until they both retired and moved down south, and then we know they lived together. Elsie Inglis was part of, she wasn't part of the original Edinburgh 7, but she wanted to become a doctor as well, and her father was supportive, so he helped her start their own medical school. There was the one around the corner in Chambers Street, but I think the one maybe most worth remembering is 219 High Street. There's it was called the hospice. It treated only women, it had only women surgeons as well. And eventually, another one was built that was called the Elsie Inglis Memorial Hospital. And by a strange coincidence, someone on Lost Edinburgh, the Facebook page, put up a picture of it, and a string of comments from people whose mums and sisters and wives had been treated there, and talked about how respectfully they were treated, right up to the point it closed when the NHS sold it off, and there's supposed to have been a German doctor who made her rounds of the wards and was always followed by her dachshund. So Grace Cattle was a real fighter. She lived at 145 Leith Walk. She treated suffragettes whose health had been ruined by force feeding, and she also refused to pay her poll tax long before it became fashionable. So she went, the poll tax man came and said, we're going to take all your possessions, ma'am, and she said, "That's fine, just don't make a ruckus." And they sold them off at the Market Cross in 1912. And a theatre company I was associated with called Citadel Arts Group reenacted this in 2009. And there they are, there's the auctioneer, and the woman, the one who's holding the sign is playing Caroline Keller as Grace Cattle. So those are the fighting doctors, they weren't the only ones. I then found out about a writer called Christine Orr. She was born at 38 Great King Street. We don't have any other locations, but she had an incredibly productive life. As a novelist, she wrote 13 novels. She worked for the BBC. She was a theatre producer, and she had her own company, the Christine Orr Company, and who did some of the first off festival, it wasn't called the Fringe yet, productions in 1947. Then I found out about a woman whose name escapes me just now, but very was lucky for me, was Ellen Charlotte Higgins. And she was the principal of the Royal Holloway College at the University of London. She went to school in Edinburgh at the Edinburgh Ladies' College, which still exists. And it's the sister college of Stuart's Novel. And then she was a mathematician, she was an athlete, she did everything, and she took over as principal and fought to keep this college going because there were plenty of academic men who felt it was their role in life to try to end it. And when she retired, someone wrote a poem to her in it. Well, the Scottish chief of manly me. And as you can see, it wasn't unjust. So she came back to Edinburgh, and she and her partner retired to 8 Warrender Park Crescent. And I do not know about anything they did here except that they joined the Ladies' Climbing Club. But I hope to find out more.
Of course, I looked at number 19, but not during the same period.
No, you would remember her as a neighbor, I'm sure.
Exactly. No, I'm there are some very, very lesbian vibes on that street because there is a sort of distinguished, there are at least 2 distinguished academics still living there, and still one may be retired, one may be seriously a professor in the uni, quite a successful painter. It's just strange. I had no idea that she was part of our street. So nice across the street.
I should also mention Iona. She lived at 30 Howe Street, and then she moved to 10 Saxe-Coburg Place, where she did her own parquet floor. And she was never without a project, and it wasn't just writing. She, in fact, I'll show you. We want to have everything she ever wrote, but these are the hardest to find. She was employed to write books about Scottish history, and she did all the research. She loved the research. She did another one called Marriage in Scotland, which we're on the trail of.
We do have copies of most of the books that have been mentioned in the library, including Iona's novel Death Where I Died, which was written after she retired, is that right?
Yes, she was finally free to write it without fear of being sacked.
Yeah.
Well, of course, the bookshops.
Well, the bookshops.
I mean, that's already been covered. But one place, there are certain things that happened, just brief incidents, but they're important. I mean, it's kind of like the Surgeons' Hall riots. They probably reverberate in ways that would take a long time to figure out. The Meadows, which is still a very politically contested area for women. Just because in terms of if you live anywhere around it and wanted to get home from the other side of it, you know, it has always been problematical and scary. And we had a period in the, I think sort of late-ish 70s, when again there was one of those spates of rapes, of assaults, of it just being really quite creepy. So it was decided, I think they were Reclaim the Night marches and things I'm not sure if there had been any in Edinburgh, but we didn't call it a Reclaim the Night march. On Halloween, there was a whole huge group of women who did an event called Witching in the Meadows. And the more theatrically minded actually got dressed up in witches' pointy hats and costumes and swarmed around the meadows, saying, you know, until the cops arrived, at which point everybody started chanting at them, why aren't you here when we need you? Why are you here? Because they'd come to protect the men from what they saw as these scary mobs of women paging around. And I thought, you know, it's quite a kind of, it was street theatre, it was a very powerful demo. It's not, and it was just a moment in time. It was a very important moment in time for me because I, you know, needless to say, Edinburgh being a wee village at that point, you know, all sorts of friends were there. And a particular friend, very important and interesting feminist journalist, Susie Innes, who is a whole other set of stories in a way.
Don't forget to mention she did the designs in your book.
That's right. She was also, you know, because a small Scottish women's press called Stramullion, which is Sigrid was part of what we were talking about, did the first edition of Mall Cutpurse. And Susie did beautiful artwork for it, because she was one of the real Renaissance women. You know, she could write, she could draw, she was a fascinating character. You know, problematical like every interesting woman is. But she came up to me and said, guess what, Ellen, you're sort of interested in writing, aren't you? At that stage I hadn't published really anything. You know, she just knew I was interested, because I was in publishing. And I said, yeah, she said, we're going to start a women's writers group. Are you interested in coming along? And in a way, I mean, that was a huge, and that was, you know, that group, which continued for several years, met sometimes in a women's house called Stanley Road in Edinburgh, which was down in New Haven, and then Susie and her partner moved out to, and a couple of other people moved out to this big ramshackle house out on Largo Bay, in Lower Largo, on the beach there. And so we used to go and have like residential writing group overnight weekends, sleepovers. But you know, all of it was not a huge group. I mean, it was, you know, 5 or 6 people, and everybody then became a published writer of some kind. You know, so everybody did become productive. It was incredibly supportive, and in a way that, you know, I mean, I didn't even mention that in the sort of starting point of Mural, but by that time it was giving me the confidence, because I had people who would, you know, it wasn't just, oh, it's wonderful, because, you know, it was you know, things were critical, but it was enthusiastic, and we all supported each other, and it was a period when it was a kind of early golden age of women's writing groups, and I think you'll find lots of other feminist writers of the period who will say some of them are still going on. I'm now in a completely different women's writing group, but it's sort of life enhancing. It's really important. It's made me confident about poetry in the same way that I used to feel unconfident about writing fiction.
I found it really interesting when we were talking about the park, talking about women's spaces and environments, and how, you know, that can be problematic for women to live how they would want to at different times of the day and everything. So I think I agree with that, like parks and beaches and places that are actually busy can be busy places. I think it's all about reclaiming these places and just building them accessible for everybody.
Space isn't anyway.
Yeah, and also I was watching this, I was on the bus today, and there was a woman walked past, a young woman, and she just looked gorgeous. She just was like, just looked very confident, and just looked at what she had on, and it was that whole thing about bodies and ownership, and women sort of having the ownership over their bodies, their physical spaces, their physical presence, and not feeling that it's dominated by any other group, men. But you know, and I just thought it's so lovely to see that generation of women feeling like that, because I grew up for so long feeling a sense I couldn't be that way, and feeling like I had so many sort of restrictions put on me about how I looked or how I should be or how I should feel, or, you know, from others, and blame because I did look a certain way or making other people feel a certain way. That was my fault as well, and because of that, you know, so just interesting, just so inspiring. I'm just like, wow, it's been amazing. So yeah, so many things has conjured up in my head, questions, but I don't think I can actually put them into words right now.
You can always send them on emails.
Yeah,
Pass them.
so I can start processing it all as well, like, you know, but that definitely.
Throw them down into a notebook and don't worry about whether they're perfect or anything.
Yeah.
Just start splurging, and then don't throw away the notebook. Play with it when you can. And then show it to somebody who you think might like to know about it.
Well, I'll just say a little bit about Lavender Menace Queer Books Archive,
Yeah, of course.
if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of bringing everything back to the right
Yes.
now, and it's just opened.
It's because of the kind of things we've been talking about that Bob and I got back together after the play was written about Lavender Menace and decided that we should preserve the books because they were published by tiny presses like Stramonian, which lasted for 10 years, by the Women's Press, the rest of Ellen's works, which now no longer exist since 1993, and they're just going to disappear. They're like orphans whose parents aren't going to fight for them anymore. And so we've had an amazing number of donations. We have over 1,000 books now, and we have a space at Edinburgh Palette at 151 London Road. We're open every Tuesday and Thursday from 11 to 4. I've got a leaflet around
I
this.
put it up on the calendar.
And I'll give you all some of our social media slips. And we are crowdfunding, and I've got some feedback forms about the next stage of the archive. We're going to classify it in the way the libraries do, and we're going to create a digital catalogue of it so that people from all over the world can go to the address and see a short plot synopsis and something about the writer perhaps. And if you could fill in these forms about how you would use something like that, that will help us decide to do, and it will help us make our case to funders for getting the support to do it. So we're going to have more events in November. We're going to have an interview with Harry Josephine Giles, the trans poet, and we've already had 4 events, including one about Ione McGregor and one that featured Ellen and another poet called Elix Wang, and you can find those on the website. So keep watching our site, and I hope that we'll see you again for one of our events.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that we've got this sort of place that's connecting now with some of the LGBT history in Edinburgh that's been before Section 28 that perhaps got disconnected a bit. So it's, really, it's wonderful. And, I feel personally really grateful that you've given Bob and resurrected this important project. I just wanted to thank Ellen and Sigrid for coming this afternoon, for sharing such vibrant and comprehensive memories of and experiences and sharing such personal things with us. So thanks very much for coming in, for all your efforts that have gone into putting together today, and thank you for coming. Thanks everyone. Thank you so much.